Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over chapters 2 and 3 of the American pageant. These are both about the colonies and they're going to run from about 1500 to 1733. We're going to be using the 16th edition of the American pageant. If you have an earlier or later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry, the content's going to be the same. Here are the key concepts for chapter 2 and here are the key concepts for chapter 3. These are both located at the beginning of the respective chapters. What I like to do is after I read the chapters, I connect the key terms back to each bullet point, and this will really help you organize the information, so I highly recommend you do it. Okay, first off, let's talk about Britain, who wants to get in on the action. As we know, the Spanish and the Portuguese have been exploring the New World, and Britain hasn't really done anything like that yet, and there are a couple of reasons for this. For one, we have the Protestant Reformation, which prevented Britain from exploring the New World because of the domestic religious conflicts. And they do eventually get involved when Queen Elizabeth, who's a Catholic, comes to power and they start exploring North America. They suppress any rebellions within the empire. For example, in Ireland, she sends troops there to crush rebellion, and eventually they are able to explore deeper into North America, which the Spanish haven't really conquered. You see a first attempt at this with Sir Walter Raleigh. He tries to establish Roanoke Island, but this is a failed British attempt at colonization. The island disappears or something. No one really knows what happens to it, so it was a failure. Meanwhile, you have Sir Francis Drake. He circumnavigated the globe, plundering Spanish settlements, and it really shows how Britain is jealous of Spanish dominance over exploration into the New World, which further increases tensions. In fact, this conflict culminates in the Spanish Armada in 1588. Essentially what happens is Spanish send in these large flotilla ships to destroy the, at that point, small British Navy, but the small British ships are able to outmaneuver the big ones, and the British defeat the Spanish, which marks new naval dominance and the decline of the Spanish Empire. So now Spain is no longer a world power and Britain is taking their spot and will become a dominant colonizing power. You should also know about primogeniture. This was the law that said that only the eldest sons could inherit land, which meant younger sons had to go in search of wealth somewhere else, and often this meant exploring the New World. They are looking for other ways to find wealth, and obviously this will encourage exploration. One thing that facilitates this is the Virginia Company. This was a joint stock company where investors, called adventurers, would pool their capital in order to fund these exploration ventures. And one day, Virginia gets a charter from King James I, who is then the King of Britain, for settlement in the New World. And a charter is basically a document saying that colonists who settle in the New World will have the same rights and protections as British citizens living in Britain. However, obviously this is kind of ironic because later with the 13 colonies, they will feel like they haven't really been represented as British citizens and the charter is a failure, they rebel, but obviously that's for a couple chapters in the future. Jamestown is established in 1607 and it is saved from collapse during the starving time by Captain John Smith. And the starving time is exactly what it sounds like. The colonists who were searching for wealth forgot to prioritize basic things like food, water, shelter, all of that. And there was a lot of starvation, a lot of disease that was plaguing the colonists. Many of them were dying, and Captain John Smith whips them into shape. He orders them to focus on food, and anyone who does otherwise will be kicked out. And this ultimately provides the first successful colony. You should also note that there are conflicts with the natives. This is really the first conflict with the natives that the British colonists encounter, and they're known as the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. The first one starts when Lord de la Warr, which I think is pretty aptly named, attacks the natives, raiding and burning their villages. It eventually ends in a peace settlement, and Pocahontas, who's a native, marries John Rolfe. In the second one, the natives try to dislodge the colonists but ultimately fail, leading the colonists to banishing the natives from their ancestral lands. So there's no longer any hope for peaceful assimilation and or coexistence, and this is ultimately a precursor to the reservation system. They're keeping themselves separated from one another because they can't exist together. Okay, so let's talk about the colonies surrounding Jamestown, specifically the Chesapeake and the Southern colonies. You should know about John Rolfe. He creates the tobacco industry in Virginia, and this is a cash crop that really stimulates the economy. There's also a push for more land. Tobacco is a soil-intensive crop, it was destroying the soil after it was planted, and you need new land in order to plant new crops. So this leads to westward expansion, calls for more people to work on it, and eventually conflicts with the natives. You should also know about the House of Burgesses in Virginia. This is the first real form of self-government in the colonies, and King James disapproves of it. He wants to make sure that the colonies can't really think for themselves. He wants to have complete control over them. Another thing you should know about is Maryland's Act of Toleration. This allowed any person who worshiped Jesus to live there and provided shelter to Roman Catholics. There was a lot of religious tensions back in England, as you may recall, with the Protestant Reformation. So this is really acting as a haven for Roman Catholics. However, it's not going to protect everyone. It's specifically for people who worship Jesus. Other denominations or atheists were not allowed in there under any circumstances. Another colony you should know about is Georgia, and this colony is established by James Oglethorpe as a buffer colony between Spanish Florida and French Louisiana. These two countries were constantly at odds with one another, constantly fighting. And Georgia was right in the middle of fighting, so they provided a buffer of sorts between the Spanish and the French. They were often given some money by the colonial legislatures to handle the conflicts and protect people, but this really prevented them from doing much with the colony. You should also note that the British are beginning to expand into the West Indies. This area had a hot climate that provided perfect conditions for growing sugarcane. African slaves are imported to work the land, and this leads to the Barbados Slave Codes, which were used to strip away fundamental rights for slaves, and these codes would later be brought to America, which eventually would lay the foundation for slavery. So here are some other things you should know about this area. Here's a little map just so you can see what exactly we're talking about. After a lot of internal conflict, Britain ends up going to colonize the Carolinas, and South Carolina prospers because it has close economic ties with the Sugar Islands in the West Indies, which we talked about in the previous slide. And they tried to enslave the natives, but this led to a brutal massacre. It's similar to what the Spanish did, but ultimately, it wasn't really effective. The natives were very resistant, and it wasn't really worth the effort to have them, unlike the Spanish, who relied on solely the natives for doing their work and would do anything just to have them work. So you can see a difference between British colonization and Spanish colonization in that sense. And in this region, rice became a cash crop, and African slaves were needed in order to grow the rice. They were really the only ones who knew how to grow the rice. However, unlike South Carolina, North Carolina was filled with squatters, who were these poverty-stricken people with differing religious beliefs that didn't fit into the Virginian plantation elite. These were people who didn't really fit in any community, and they all just sort of went to North Carolina because that was really the only place they could stay. You should also note some other conflicts with the natives in this region. For example, you have the Tuscarora War and the Yamasee Indians encounter, and both of these really go to show how bad native relations were in the South. So let's talk about some takeaways you should be getting from this region. You should know about the plantation elite. They control colonial politics, and they're wealthy because of the cash crop economy, which was based on exporting commercial agricultural products. And you'll see that they want to expand westward, which will also lead to conflicts. And with this region, you'll see that they have some religious tolerance, as seen with the Act of Toleration in Maryland, but the Anglican Church remained a dominant part of the culture there. In general, the area is also male-dominated, and it had a defined hierarchy of status: backcountry farmers versus the plantation elite. The farmers who didn't have a lot of land, didn't produce popular crops, versus the plantation elite, who grew these cash crops that were in high demand. And then finally, labor systems began to shift from indentured servitude, which we'll talk about in later chapters, to slavery after Bacon's Rebellion. Again, this is a little bit premature, more on this later, but this is just a little preview that you should definitely note from this region. Okay, so now let's talk about the northern and the middle colonies, and as we're going to see, they are very different compared to the south. For one, most of the first settlers went to the south for wealth, while others in Britain immigrated to the north for religious freedom. And really what they want to practice is Calvinism, this idea based on the theological teachings of John Calvin, which believed in predestination, and it said that God determined a person's fate for better or worse. And although their fate was irreversible, some Calvinists believed that they were destined for salvation and led their lives quite literally with the holier-than-thou attitude. There was also this idea of conversion, which was this intense religious experience where a person claimed God told them that they were destined to salvation. So after they had experienced a conversion, they would become an elect member of the church. The church at this point was very exclusive. They wanted to make sure that every member was holy and had a right to be there. And the people who are really coming from Britain to the northern and middle colonies are really separated into two groups, one of which are the Puritans, and these people wanted to purify the Anglican Church and believed only those who had been converted should be given church membership. Back in England, this wasn't really the case, and it wasn't as strict as the Puritans and Pilgrims would make it in the northern colonies, specifically in Massachusetts, so this is what their goal is in coming to the New World. However, the Pilgrims, or the Separatists, wanted to completely separate from the church. They wanted nothing to do with the Anglican Church because they believed it was unholy in certain ways and it was unfixable. And so the Puritans and the Pilgrims go on the Mayflower and they create the Mayflower Compact, which is the first democratic agreement that established a basic form of self-government within the colonies. And they eventually all settle in the Massachusetts Bay Area. Some of them, though, do go to the Caribbean to make some money. And you should note that soon after, there's a great migration where thousands of refugees flee religious persecution in England and want to establish a model Christian society. And here's a little area of where they settled. These are the northern and middle colonies where we're going to be talking about. And essentially, they're trying to create a city upon a hill, holy utopia. And this is really what John Winthrop, who's the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, wants to do. This perfect model of mankind for people to live by. However, there is some resistance that you need to know about. For example, Anne Hutchinson challenged the orthodox ideas of predestination and was eventually banished. You also have Roger Williams, who wanted a separation of church and state, and this was ultimately denied, so he goes on and creates Rhode Island, and this is a haven for religious dissenters, people who don't believe in Calvinism or other orthodox theological teachings. And finally, you have William Penn, who creates Pennsylvania, and this is a haven for Quakers, who are pacifists. And they maintain friendly relations with natives and women, which is something that you don't see throughout much of this area, or in general in the colonies. And Penn's whole idea in creating this colony was the idea of a holy experiment. It was a very liberal colony compared to the other more religiously strict northern colonies, so it shows that although there are certain characteristics to each region, not everything is set in stone, and you're going to see that people will come to Pennsylvania for a little bit more religious freedom. However, one thing that is kind of odd about Pennsylvania, I guess you could say, is they had these blue laws, which were basically these very strict laws and banned things that they considered immoral. There was this idea of a Protestant work ethic in the northern colonies, and anything that was spent for leisure, like playing cards, were considered bad behavior and were outlawed by the blue laws. So I guess that's something a little bit different about Pennsylvania as well. Okay, so let's continue talking about the northern and the middle colonies, specifically the northern colonies. In fact, Connecticut, for example, had the Fundamental Orders, which laid out a basis for their state constitution. However, they also had the Pequot War, which led to a brutal massacre of the Pequot Indians, growing tensions due to expansion into the West. You should also know about King Philip's War in Connecticut, where native chief Metacom, who the British called King Philip, creates an intertribal alliance to coordinate assaults on New England settlements. And although it slowed expansion, it ultimately failed to do anything of significance. You should also know about the Dutch colony New Amsterdam. It was eventually taken over by Britain and became present-day New York. And this is super significant because after Britain got control of New Amsterdam, they had complete control over the eastern seaboard. So there was no more foreign wedge. You should also note that the northern and middle colonies developed a mixed manufacturing economy. They weren't completely reliant on one sort of method of income like the South were with their agrarian lifestyle. Although the North did have some agricultural capacities, they didn't use as they did their manufacturing capacities, specifically shipbuilding. And one group you should definitely know about is the New England Confederation. This was a group created by the northeastern colonies, except for Rhode Island, which allowed for communication about intercolonial affairs and for a better defense while England was occupied with its own civil war. and these were really like the baby steps at colonial unity. However, the British also make their own organization called the Dominion of New England, and this is run by the British Edmund Andros, and it's made to bolster the defense of the colonies in the event of war and enforce the despised navigation laws, which restricted colonial trade with countries besides the British Crown. And this ultimately leads to a lot of smuggling. The colonies don't really abide by the law. Britain thinks that enforcing the navigation laws is necessary because, as we'll talk about later, there's this idea of mercantilism where the colonies are meant to enrich the mother country, in this case England, and if they're doing anything but that, you're losing profits and you're losing your wealth. However, this all comes crashing down with the Glorious Revolution in England. This inspires the colonies to overthrow Edmund Andros, and they're like, would you get off my back? So the British get out of there. And although Massachusetts becomes a royal colony, Britain ends up using salutary neglect to calm down the colonists. They aren't really enforcing, again, those navigation laws, a bunch of other laws, and they're really laying low. And this will continue for several years. And as this tightens, as the British restrict their policies in the future, you'll see that the colonies will resist this because they have lived so long with this idea of salutary neglect that they barely felt Britain's colonizing hand on them. Finally, here are the takeaways for the northern and middle colonies. Essentially, Puritan religious motives for colonization were facilitated by the Great Migration. You should also know that we just talked about the difference between the New England Confederation and the Dominion of New England. And keep in mind that there is no religious tolerance, unlike the South and somewhat in the middle colonies, but in the North there is no religious tolerance. They banished Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams simply for rejecting norms. You should also note the mixed economy. There's some agriculture, but they're not completely reliant on cash crops. They do some trading, shipbuilding, and this is really important because they aren't reliant solely on agriculture like the South is, and you're going to see these regional distinctions develop as we move on, especially during the Civil War. You should also keep in mind that white church-going males had the most influence in colonial politics because they were the, quote, elect, and therefore considered the most capable of leading the colonies. And finally, just remember, middle colonies were a little bit more religiously tolerant, and they remained friendly to the natives and women. That about does it for these chapters. Here is how we got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions, and please, please, please be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us out and lets us know that this video helped you, so we can make videos in the future.